The ancient Greeks have had one of the largest impacts on the whole of Western civilization of any single group in history. Greek influence can be seen in many aspects of American architecture, especially in political establishments, and the Greek language was formerly the lingua franca of the entirety of the eastern Mediterranean, with Greek nations even stretching as far east as the Punjab region of modern India and Pakistan directly after the fall of Alexander's empire. But across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians are one of those groups that most people have heard of, but probably don't actually know a lot about. Who were the Phoenicians? What languages did they speak? What did they contribute to European and Middle Eastern culture? Did they ever have an empire? And are they still around in the modern era? Today we're going to look at all of those questions and more, discussing one of the people who, despite their huge contributions to world culture, are seldom given the credit they deserve. In order to look at the ancient Phoenicians, we're going to have to go much further back in time, back to when the Egyptians ruled Nubia, Syria, and Canaan, a region in the Levant you might recognize from many of the ancient stories in the holy books for the Abrahamic faiths. The people of Canaan were a Semitic bunch, and members of the Canaanite branch included the Hebrew language and, of course, Phoenician, which was predominant in modern-day Lebanon and related more loosely to Aramaic languages used by the Assyrians. Now, because this region of Canaan was under the rule of Egypt for so long, the Canaanites started taking up many of the customs and practices used by the Egyptians, including adopting the use of hieroglyphs, which would later evolve into the Phoenician alphabet over 3,000 years ago, which would become one of the first official written scripts, and it's extremely difficult to overstate just how much of a radical innovation this was. Although virtually unrecognizable to us now, the Phoenician alphabet became the inspiration for dozens of different scripts around the globe today, with one of the first derivations, Greek, also later evolving into the Latin, Cyrillic, and Coptic alphabets, the latter of which was used for the Egyptian Coptic language, which was spoken by a significant minority of Egypt's population up until the 17th century, although we'll get back to that later. The Tifinagh script used by ancient Berber tribes is also most likely a descendant of the Phoenician script, and despite formerly being banned for use in the open in many countries, many Berbers have started using the script once again as not to erode any more of their culture. The Aramaic script, another Phoenician derivation used by the Assyrians, would later evolve into the Hebrew and Arabic scripts, and this is where it gets completely mind-blowing, as the Brahmic scripts of South Asia are actually, you guessed it, also derivative of ancient Phoenician, and gave rise to virtually the entirety of native scripts used in South Asia, and many in Southeast Asia as well, including Burmese, Thai, Javanese, as well as Tibetan and the Mongol script as well, one of the few modern scripts actually written top to bottom instead of horizontally. So as you can tell, the overwhelming majority of modern human scripts used to express written language are derivative of a single source, and we can all thank the Phoenicians for that. Now, as for whether or not the Phoenicians ever had an empire, well, sort of. Phoenicia was in many ways very similar to the Greeks at the time, being a collection of city-states with no real capital, centralized government, or concise borders to speak of, yet were still incredibly influential in the Mediterranean, trading along the entire North African coast, along with Anatolia, Iberia, and many Mediterranean islands such as Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Malta. The Lebanese city of Tyre was the Athens of ancient Phoenicia, being the center of the Phoenician pseudo-empire, and many major Phoenician colonies were established throughout the Mediterranean, especially in North Africa. By far the most prominent and well-known Phoenician colony in all of the Mediterranean was the city-state of Carthage, established 800 BC, and is located in modern-day Tunisia, essentially right on top of where the capital Tunis is located today. Although the Phoenicians were conquered by the Persians and then later the Greeks a few hundred years after the founding of Carthage, the Carthaginians were thriving during this time, while the original Phoenicians lost much of their language, culture, and autonomy. Carthage greatly expanded its territory to include much of the Maghrebi coast from Tripoli, Libya to Tangier, Morocco, and was one of the dominant powers in the Mediterranean during this time, although they were fierce rivals with the Greeks and Romans, competing over much of the same Mediterranean territory, and this led to the conflicts known as the Punic Wars, with Punic being another name for the Carthaginians, and the Carthaginian dialect of Phoenician is also referred to as Punic. In addition to hostilities from the Greeks and Romans to the north, the Carthaginians were also opposed by many of the Berber tribes indigenous to the Maghreb known as Numidians, although many Numidians traded and cooperated with the Punics, and it's very possible that a significant proportion of people in Carthage had native Berber ancestry. During the wars, Carthage annexed much of Iberia and North Africa, and despite having some victories under the infamously zany general Hannibal of Carthage, the Carthaginians would go on to lose all three wars with Rome. Thus, the Empire of Carthage was completely dissolved and the city of Carthage sacked, with all of its territory being absorbed by the Romans, and many of the inhabitants were captured, sold into slavery, and mostly replaced by Roman colonists from the Italian mainland, eventually becoming the Roman province of Africa. The Carthaginian or Punic language is actually believed to have survived in the Roman Empire for another 400 to 500 years before its complete extinction in the 5th century AD, while back in the Phoenician homeland in 11, the area was annexed by the Romans not long after, known as the Roman province of Syria, and it would appear that it was around this time that the last embers of the Phoenician people, culture, and language were thoroughly extinguished for the rest of history, aside from their alphabet, which ironically still lived on through the very nations that stamped out their empire. Interestingly, a Roman province known as Phoenice was established in the former Phoenician territory of the Levant, although by this time the Phoenician language in the area was long extinct, being replaced mostly by Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. Now, as to whether any Phoenicians or Carthaginians have survived to the modern age, Phoenician genes certainly are present in many North Africans, Levantines, and others. And we've talked about the region of North Africa and its inhabitants many times here, and it seems every single time there's at least one person who has some strong opinions to the contrary, so I'll try to explain as best I can. I made a poll on the channel regarding Arab identity, and out of 9,000 people that voted, only about half thought that the Arabic-speaking countries of North Africa were predominantly ethnically Arab. Before the invasions of North Africa by Islamic Arab forces shortly after Muhammad's death, the region was primarily inhabited by Egyptians and Berbers, speaking the Egyptian and Berber languages respectively, both members of the Afro-Asiatic family, but not of the Semitic branch, which includes Arabic. Over the centuries of Arab rule and inter-regional migration, the Egyptian language went extinct, and many of the Berber languages were confined to pockets in the Maghreb. Many Egyptians maintain a distinct pre-Arab identity, especially the Coptic Christians, who have remained mostly unassimilated into the larger Islamic Egyptian population since the Arab invasions over 1,000 years ago, and although they no longer speak the Coptic or Old Egyptian language as a common tongue, many do not claim to be Arabs, but many others do. But Egyptians are not and never have been Berbers, who have historically inhabited all of the lands of the Maghreb and northwest Africa. Similarly to Egypt, the Maghreb was conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century AD, very soon after the formation of the First Islamic Caliphate. Today, the bulk of Moroccans and Algerians would identify as Arab Berbers, Arabized Berbers, or some other similar identity, while unlike Egypt, there are still pockets of full-blooded indigenous peoples speaking Berber languages and living in pockets scattered throughout the Maghreb. Tunisians, on the other hand, are much more likely to identify with an Arab identity than their Algerian and Moroccan neighbors, but to the best of my knowledge, there's no movement in Tunisia, the Maghreb, or anywhere else that wishes to identify with the ancient Carthaginian nation, most likely because the region swapped hands so many times in the first place. The Carthaginians were just a modest ripple in the overall history of North African countries. However, interestingly, there is a not so insignificant proportion of the Lebanese population that rejects the modern-day association with Arabs in favor of identification with the ancient Phoenicians, and this is especially common among Lebanese Christians such as Maronites, and to be honest, who can blame them? The Phoenicians truly are one of the most underrated ancient peoples of human history. I'll go ahead and leave a poll in the top right-hand corner of this video and let you go decide for yourself whether the Lebanese are the last surviving Phoenicians, or whether they're ethnically Arab like their neighbors, or maybe something else entirely. Maybe I'll start making polling a tradition for my videos. Although the Phoenician and Carthaginian nations and cultures are indeed long dead, their legacy will probably survive on forever, or at least for the rest of human history, as it doesn't look like the Latin, Arabic, or Devanagari scripts are going out anytime soon. And from turning ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs to the words you write and type every day, the Phoenicians have facilitated many important innovations for the entire world. Please go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the Phoenicians and Carthaginians of the Levant in North Africa and the identity of the modern Lebanese and Tunisian peoples. And as always, thank you all for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.